Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's drift into a peaceful slumber together. This time I will tell you about Scheherazade and King Shahryar. In the grand palaces of ancient Persia ruled the mighty King Shahryar, a man who commanded immense power over his kingdom. His land stretched far and wide, with wealth flowing from every corner of his dominion. His rule was marked by luxury, splendor, and the obedience of his subjects. Yet, for all the riches and glory of his kingdom, Shahryar's heart was a battlefield, consumed by grief and betrayal. This grief began when Shahryar discovered that his beloved wife, the queen, had betrayed him. The revelation shattered the king's trust and wounded him more deeply than any physical wound could. In the ancient times, loyalty was revered above all virtues, and infidelity was considered the ultimate betrayal. The queen's betrayal was more than just an affair. It was a direct assault on the king's honor, a violation of everything he held dear. This act, committed in secret behind the royal walls, tore apart the king's perception of love and loyalty. What Shahryar had once viewed as the safest and most secure of relationships, marriage, was suddenly stripped of its sanctity. His pain and humiliation grew like an uncontrollable fire, consuming him from the inside. This wound of betrayal left a scar on his soul, and as the days passed, his anger and grief transformed into hatred for all women. He could no longer see women as innocent or trustworthy. They had all become the same in his eyes, symbols of treachery and deceit. Shahryar's reaction to his wife's betrayal was not one of sorrow or quiet reflection. Instead, it was an explosive rage, one that drove him to extreme measures. In his fury, he made a decision that would change the lives of countless women across the kingdom. He would marry a new woman each day, and at the end of the night, he would have her executed. The logic behind this barbaric act was simple. He would avenge the wrong done to him by making sure no woman ever had the chance to betray him again. This act of vengeance was driven by a desire to regain control, to punish women for the sin of his wife's infidelity, and to prevent any future emotional harm. Every night, Shahryar would marry a young woman of the kingdom, often chosen from the noble families, bringing her to the palace to spend the night with him. On the following morning, as the first light of dawn broke across the sky, he would give the order for her execution. His soldiers would drag the young woman from his chambers and bring her to the executioner, where she would meet a grim fate. At first, the kingdom was shaken by this cruel decree, but as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the people began to grow accustomed to the routine. The royal palace became a place of dread, not just for the young women who were selected to marry the king, but for their families as well. Each marriage became a fleeting moment of joy and hope, only to be followed by a death sentence in the morning. It was a cycle of despair, one that seemed to have no end. The noble families of the kingdom, fearing for their daughters' lives, became more reluctant to offer their young women for the king's nightly marriages. The once thriving court of the king grew quieter, with less and less young women willing to take part in the royal wedding process. Families, in a desperate attempt to protect their daughters, began to hide them, keeping them away from the royal palace. The kingdom, once a place of vibrancy and celebration, now became a land haunted by fear and uncertainty. As time passed, Shahryar's rule grew increasingly tyrannical. His people, once loyal to him, began to question his sanity and justice. Some whispered behind closed doors, wondering if the king's grief had driven him mad. Others questioned whether his actions were truly in pursuit of justice or whether he had simply become a man consumed by his own pain. Regardless of the whispers, Shahryar remained unshaken in his decision. His pain and anger had clouded his judgment, and the king could no longer separate rational thought from emotional turmoil. Yet, as the months turned into years, Shahryar's heart grew heavier. His anger was not satiated by the countless deaths he had caused, nor did the execution of innocent women bring him the peace he had hoped for. Instead, it only deepened his sorrow. The absence of any real connection with the women he married made him feel more isolated than ever. Each night, he lay in his grand bedchamber surrounded by riches, yet he was consumed by the same grief and loneliness that had plagued him since the discovery of his wife's betrayal. In his attempts to regain control over his life, he had lost his ability to truly live, and the emptiness in his heart seemed insurmountable. But Shahryar's actions were not without consequences. As the number of executed women grew, so did the resentment in the kingdom. People feared the king and his wrath, but they also mourned for the innocent lives lost at his hands. The kingdom had become a shadow of its former self, with the once thriving court now reduced to a place of mourning and sorrow. There was no joy in the land, and the people had grown weary of the endless cycle of death. In the midst of all this suffering, Shahryar's reign continued without interruption. His heart, filled with bitterness and anger, refused to forgive or forget. His hope of regaining control over his own life through vengeance had failed, and instead, he had trapped himself in a cycle of cruelty. He had become a king of pain, consumed by a wounded heart that could not heal. At this point, there seemed to be no end to the king's torment. The palace walls echoed with the silent cries of the women who had met their tragic fate. The streets outside the palace, once full of life and excitement, were now filled with whispers of fear. Shahryar's actions had created a kingdom in turmoil, a land where death and sorrow reigned supreme. And yet, amid this darkness, there would soon emerge a glimmer of hope. Little did the king know, but the answer to his torment would come from an unexpected source, a woman whose wisdom and bravery would change the fate of the entire kingdom. This woman, Scheherazade, would be the key to unlocking the king's heart and offering him the redemption he so desperately needed. But that, as they say, is another story. As the story of King Shahryar's cruelty spread throughout the kingdom, a growing sense of dread permeated the air. The once bustling streets had fallen silent, and a heavy fog of fear hung over the land. People spoke in hushed tones about the king's brutal rule, his endless marriages, and the senseless executions of innocent women. In the face of such despair, it seemed as though there was no hope for the future, no end to the suffering that the king's wrath had caused. But in the midst of this hopelessness, there emerged a woman whose courage and wisdom would change the fate of the kingdom forever. Scheherazade, the daughter of the king's vizier, was a woman of great intellect, beauty, and strength. She had grown up surrounded by knowledge, having been taught the art of storytelling by her father, who was one of the most learned men in the kingdom. From a young age, Scheherazade had shown a remarkable talent for weaving intricate tales, captivating those around her with her words. Unlike most women in the kingdom, Scheherazade was not afraid of the king's wrath. In fact, she had come to view the king's actions not as a source of fear, but as an opportunity to save herself, her people, and the kingdom as a whole. She was determined to find a way to end the cycle of death and sorrow that had plagued their lives for so long. And she knew that her knowledge, her intelligence, and her ability to tell a captivating story could be the key to doing just that. One day, Scheherazade came to her father with a bold idea. She would offer herself to the king as his wife. She believed that, through her storytelling, she could not only survive the night, but also eventually change the king's heart. Her father, horrified by the idea, tried to dissuade her. He feared for her life, knowing the king's ruthless nature and the fate that had befallen so many before her. But Scheherazade was steadfast in her resolve. She had a plan, one that would require both wisdom and bravery, and she was determined to see it through. "My dear father," Scheherazade said, "I do not offer myself to the king out of mere desperation, but because I believe that I can save not only myself, but the lives of countless others. I know the power of a story, and I will use that power to change the king's heart. If I do not succeed, then my life will be forfeit, but at least I will have tried." Her father, though deeply concerned, could see the fire of determination in his daughter's eyes. She was not simply a naive girl driven by emotion. She was a woman of intellect and wisdom, one who understood the gravity of her decision. And so, with a heavy heart, he gave his reluctant approval, knowing that this might be the only chance to end the madness that had taken hold of the kingdom. Scheherazade prepared herself for the dangerous journey ahead. She knew that this would not be an easy task. She would be entering the very heart of the king's wrath, and if she failed, the consequences would be dire. But she was not afraid. She had spent years studying the art of storytelling, mastering the craft of spinning tales that could captivate, inspire, and even heal. She believed that if she could weave a story that was both thrilling and thought-provoking, she might be able to change the king's mind and end the cycle of death once and for all. The night of her wedding to King Shahryar arrived, and Scheherazade entered the royal palace with her head held high. She was dressed in the finest clothes, her beauty radiant, but it was not her outward appearance that she relied on. It was her mind, her intellect, and her ability to tell a story that she knew would be her salvation. As she entered the king's chambers, she felt a strange sense of calm. She had already prepared herself for the worst, but she also knew that she was not entering this battle alone. She had the power of words on her side. King Shahryar, sitting on his grand throne, eyed her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. He had seen countless women come and go, each one as fleeting as the last, and he expected no different from Scheherazade. But Scheherazade was different. She approached the king with a quiet confidence, her heart steady and her mind sharp. As the evening wore on, she engaged the king in conversation, speaking with intelligence and grace. She knew that she had only one chance to make an impression, and she would not squander it. As the night drew to a close, Scheherazade knew that it was time to begin her story. She could sense the king's growing curiosity, the subtle shift in his demeanor as he leaned forward, eager to hear more. She began telling a tale, a story of mystery and adventure, one that was designed to captivate the king's attention and draw him into a world of imagination. But as the night wore on and the hour grew late, Scheherazade deliberately stopped her story at a crucial point, leaving the king hanging on her every word. The king, frustrated by the abrupt ending, demanded that Scheherazade finish the story the following night. And so, with that, she had secured her first victory. She had gained another night of life, and with it, a chance to continue her plan. Each night, she would tell the king a new story, each one more captivating than the last, each one leaving him desperate to hear more. But Scheherazade's storytelling was not simply for entertainment. Each tale she wove was carefully designed to teach the king valuable lessons about life, love, justice, and mercy. She knew that if she could slowly change the king's heart and mind, she might be able to stop his cruel actions once and for all. The power of her words, her wisdom, and her patience were her greatest weapons in this battle. As the nights passed, Shahryar began to look forward to Scheherazade's stories. The walls of his heart, which had been hardened by years of grief and pain, slowly began to soften. With each story, he was forced to confront the darkness in his own soul, and he began to question the path of destruction he had chosen. Scheherazade's tales, full of wisdom and truth, began to chip away at the fortress of bitterness he had built around himself. But even as the king's heart began to shift, Scheherazade knew that the real test was still ahead. She had won him over with her stories, but the battle for his soul was far from over. As she continued to weave her tales night after night, she remained determined to see her plan through to the end. She had started this journey not only to save her own life, but to save the lives of all the women in the kingdom and to restore peace and justice to the land. As Scheherazade sat by King Shahryar, the night was still young, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the first of what would become 1,001 nights of storytelling, a journey that would determine not only her fate, but the fate of countless women in the kingdom. In this first story, she would need to set the tone for the nights to come, ensuring that she would captivate the king's attention and spark enough curiosity to keep him coming back for more. This was not just about entertainment, it was about survival, and the survival of her people. Scheherazade knew that the first story would be the most important. It would serve as the foundation for the rest of the nights. She had to create a story that was both fascinating and filled with lessons that could slowly chip away at the king's hardened heart. But she also had to leave him wanting more. She couldn't afford to finish the story too soon. If she did, her plan would fall apart. The king must be kept intrigued, engaged, and most importantly, curious about what would happen next. Sitting on the edge of the grand bed where the king awaited her, Scheherazade began her tale. She spoke of a distant kingdom, one much like Shahryar's own. A kingdom ruled by a just and wise king who had earned the love and respect of his people. The king was loved not only for his wisdom, but also for his fairness and his deep understanding of human nature. This king, unlike Shahryar, believed in the power of compassion and justice. His rule was marked by peace, prosperity, and harmony. But the peace of this kingdom was shattered one day when a great calamity struck. A mysterious force, an evil sorcerer with dark powers, cast a shadow over the land, plunging it into turmoil. The people were desperate, and the king, who had always been wise and compassionate, found himself unable to protect his people. The king, in his despair, sought the counsel of a great sage, hoping that the sage could help him find a way to save his kingdom from destruction. The sage, a wise and ancient man, told the king that the only way to defeat the sorcerer was to embark on a dangerous quest, a journey that would take the king into the heart of the sorcerer's dark realm. The king would have to face unimaginable dangers, but if he succeeded, he would not only save his kingdom, but also prove his strength and honor. The king, though fearful, agreed to undertake the quest. Scheherazade's voice was steady and commanding, drawing the king in. As she spoke, she described the treacherous journey the king took, through forests filled with beasts, across deserts where the sun scorched the earth, and through mountains where the winds howled like ghosts. Each step the king took brought him closer to his ultimate goal, confronting the sorcerer and restoring peace to his kingdom. But as the king faced danger after danger, he began to question his own strength. Doubts crept into his mind. Was he truly strong enough to defeat such an evil force? Could he really save his people? The king's journey became not just one of physical trials, but of inner transformation. As he ventured deeper into the sorcerer's realm, he began to face his own fears, his own insecurities, and the darkness that had taken root in his heart. This is where Scheherazade's storytelling took a turn. As the king ventured closer to the sorcerer's lair, he was faced with a choice: to continue on his path, risking his life for his people, or to turn back, saving himself but condemning his kingdom to ruin. The choice was a difficult one. The king's heart was torn between duty and self-preservation. In the end, he chose to continue on, not because he was certain of his success, but because he could not bear to see his people suffer. Scheherazade's voice grew softer, more intimate. She spoke of the king's final confrontation with the sorcerer, a battle not only of magic, but of will. The sorcerer, seeing the king's resolve, taunted him, trying to break his spirit. The sorcerer, a master of manipulation, tried to exploit the king's doubts and weaknesses. But the king, despite his fear and uncertainty, fought back with all his strength, not for himself, but for his kingdom. In the end, the king triumphed over the sorcerer, not because of his magical powers or his physical strength, but because of the courage he found within himself. He had confronted his own darkness and emerged victorious. The kingdom was saved, and the people rejoiced. The king returned home, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had learned the true meaning of strength and leadership. But just as Scheherazade was about to reach the conclusion of the story, she paused. She let the silence linger in the air, her eyes meeting the king's. The story was unfinished, the resolution still hanging in the air. The king, his curiosity piqued, leaned forward, eager to hear the end of the story. "I must leave the ending for tomorrow," Scheherazade said softly, her voice filled with mystery. "If I finish it now, it will lose its magic." But rest assured, the king did return victorious, and the kingdom was saved. "Tomorrow, I will tell you the rest, and you will learn the final lesson." The king's frustration was palpable. He demanded that she finish the story, but Scheherazade remained firm. Her plan had worked. By leaving the story unfinished, she had sparked the king's curiosity and ensured that he would want to hear more. The king's eyes flashed with desire for the rest of the tale, and in that moment, Scheherazade knew she had secured another night of life. She stood and bowed to the king, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tomorrow night, my king, I will tell you the rest of the story. Until then, may your dreams be filled with peace." The king, now deeply intrigued, dismissed her with a wave of his hand, eager to hear what would happen next. As Scheherazade left the room, she could feel the weight of the night's success. The first battle had been won, but there was still much to be done. She had planted the seed of curiosity in the king's heart, and now she had to nurture it, carefully crafting each story to bring him closer to the transformation she so desperately hoped for. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Scheherazade's nightly storytelling became an integral part of King Shahryar's life. What began as a simple tool for survival had grown into something more profound, a ritual, a shared experience between the two that neither could escape. Scheherazade had not only found a way to delay her death, but she had also discovered a way to draw the king closer to her, to break down the emotional barriers that had surrounded him for years. Each night, as she entered the royal chambers, she brought with her a new story, each one more captivating than the last, each one carefully crafted to engage the king's imagination and stir his emotions. The stories were not merely meant to entertain, but to challenge the king, to push him to reconsider his perspective on life, love, and justice. Each tale was a reflection of the themes Scheherazade wished to explore: honor, sacrifice, love, betrayal, forgiveness, and the complexity of the human heart. At first, the king was simply intrigued. His anger had not yet faded, and his soul was still haunted by the grief of his wife's betrayal. But the power of Scheherazade's words slowly began to take root in his heart. Night after night, he found himself more and more eager to hear her stories. Her intelligence, her wisdom, and her ability to craft such intricate and meaningful tales began to spark something in him, a curiosity, a yearning for something more than the bitterness that had consumed him for so long. With each passing night, the king became more and more fascinated by Scheherazade's stories. The emotional walls he had built around his heart started to crack, and he found himself reflecting on the deeper meaning behind her tales. Each story seemed to resonate with him in unexpected ways, forcing him to confront his own darkness and the pain he had buried deep within. It was as if Scheherazade's words were a mirror, reflecting not just the characters in her stories, but the king's own inner turmoil. One night, as Scheherazade told a particularly moving tale of a great hero who sacrificed everything for the good of his people, the king felt a stirring in his soul. He had never considered that kind of selflessness, that kind of devotion. It was a concept foreign to him, but as he listened to the story, he found himself imagining a world where he, too, could act with such noble intent. The idea of compassion began to take root in his mind, and though he would never admit it aloud, he began to wonder if he, too, could change. Scheherazade, ever astute, noticed the subtle shift in the king's demeanor. She could sense that her words were beginning to have an effect, that the king was starting to soften, even if just a little. And so, she continued her stories, each one carefully crafted to help the king explore the complexities of human nature. She told tales of betrayal, where characters who had been wronged found forgiveness in their hearts and moved forward with grace. She spoke of justice, where wrongdoers faced the consequences of their actions, but were given opportunities for redemption. And she wove stories of love, where lovers found each other not through grand gestures, but through the quiet understanding and trust that grew over time. Each night, the king found himself listening more intently, waiting for Scheherazade to reveal the wisdom hidden in her tales. And with each story, a little more of the hardness in his heart began to dissolve. He began to understand that the pain he had carried for so long, his grief over his wife's betrayal, was not something that could be healed through revenge and violence. He began to see that there was more to life than punishment, that there was room for mercy, understanding, and most of all, change. But while the king's heart was slowly being transformed by the stories, Scheherazade knew that she had to remain vigilant. Every night was a test, and though the king's interest in her stories grew, she understood that this was only the beginning. The king's anger was deeply rooted, and it would take more than just a few stories to completely change the way he viewed the world. She had to be patient, to keep weaving her tales and drawing him closer to the realization that his path of vengeance and cruelty would ultimately destroy him and everyone around him. The stories she told began to reflect the very challenges that the king faced in his own life. She told stories of rulers who had been consumed by their own power and greed, and how their kingdoms had fallen into ruin. She spoke of wise kings who ruled with kindness and justice, and how their reigns brought peace and prosperity to their people. She reminded him that true power came not from the fear of others, but from the respect and love of those who followed you. And still, the king's curiosity deepened. He had never before met anyone like Scheherazade, a woman whose intellect and strength captivated him, whose words held such power over him. He found himself wondering about her, who she was, what drove her, and why she was so different from all the other women he had known. Despite his initial reservations, he began to feel something for her, respect, admiration, and perhaps even affection. But the king was not ready to admit this to himself. His heart had been too scarred by betrayal, and the walls he had built around it were not easily breached. One evening, after hearing a particularly moving story about the importance of forgiveness, the king sat in silence for a long while. His mind was racing, his emotions conflicted. He had been a man of vengeance for so long, and the idea of forgiveness seemed alien to him. Could he forgive the woman who had wronged him? Could he forgive himself for the pain he had caused? The questions lingered in his mind, unanswered, as he turned to Scheherazade and asked her to continue the tale the following night. But even as he asked, he knew that the stories Scheherazade told were doing something to him, something that was changing him from the inside out. The bitterness that had once consumed him was beginning to fade, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He found himself wondering what it would be like to rule with wisdom and mercy, to rule in a way that would bring peace to his kingdom rather than fear. Each night, Scheherazade's stories continued to evolve, becoming more complex and filled with deeper moral lessons. She carefully wove tales that not only entertained, but also challenged the king's worldview, forcing him to confront his own shortcomings and consider new possibilities. And with each night, the king grew more and more captivated by her, not just as a storyteller, but as a woman who possessed a depth of wisdom that he had never encountered before. It was clear to Scheherazade that her plan was working, but she also knew that the battle was far from over. The king had come a long way, but he had not yet fully embraced the lessons she had been trying to teach him. There was still more work to be done, more stories to be told, and more lessons to impart. She remained patient, focused, and determined. As long as she had the king's ear, as long as he was willing to listen to her stories, she would continue to fight for the redemption of his heart. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the effect of Scheherazade's stories on King Shahryar became ever more profound. What had started as a mere exercise in survival for her had evolved into something deeper, an emotional journey that was transforming the very fabric of the king's soul. The king, who had once been consumed by anger, distrust, and bitterness, now found himself drawn to Scheherazade in ways that he never imagined possible. It wasn't just the stories themselves that captivated him, but the woman telling them, her wisdom, her grace, and her resilience in the face of a fate so cruel. King Shahryar had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the nights. As each evening approached, he found himself anticipating the next installment of Scheherazade's stories. Her tales had woven a complex web of emotions in his heart, unraveling the pain of betrayal and the deep wounds he had suffered over the years. Slowly but surely, the wall he had constructed around his heart began to crumble, piece by piece. Initially, he had viewed Scheherazade as just another woman, one more to add to the long list of wives he had married and executed. But over time, she had become more than just a woman. She was a mystery, an enigma, and he couldn't help but be fascinated by her intelligence and her unwavering courage. Every night, he found himself thinking not only of the stories she told, but of her as a person. He began to see her not as a mere means to an end, but as someone who held a rare wisdom, one that challenged the way he had always viewed the world. Her stories touched him in ways he didn't understand. She spoke of love, sacrifice, honor, and redemption, themes that made him question his own actions and beliefs. The more he listened, the more he found himself asking difficult questions about the choices he had made in his life. Could it be that he, too, had the power to change? Could the man he had become, hardened, vengeful, and lost in his grief, find a way to heal, to find peace and forgiveness, both for himself and for the people he had hurt? The king's nights, once filled with darkness and despair, were now filled with the light of possibility. The emotional storm that had raged in his heart for years began to calm. It wasn't an immediate transformation, and Shahryar still wrestled with his anger and doubts, but Scheherazade's stories had sown the seeds of change. He began to look at her in a new light, and the respect he once had for her intelligence soon turned into admiration, then into something more, something tender, something that, for the first time in many years, felt like affection. He found himself thinking about her even when she was not in his presence. Her voice, calm and soothing, echoed in his mind long after the stories had ended. He thought about the way she looked at him, not with fear or submission, but with an unwavering sense of confidence, as if she believed in him, in his ability to change, to become a better man. It was a belief that had long since faded from his own heart, but Scheherazade seemed to hold it for him, and that belief began to take root in his soul. One night, after hearing yet another captivating tale of courage and redemption, Shahryar sat in silence for what felt like hours. He was deep in thought, reflecting on the lessons he had learned from her stories. For the first time in years, he wondered if he could find it in himself to forgive, not only the woman who had betrayed him, but also himself for the actions he had taken in response to that betrayal. As he sat in the stillness of his chamber, the king felt a sense of guilt wash over him. He had lived so long in anger, driven by a desire for revenge, and had caused so much pain to the women of his kingdom, all because of his own wounded heart. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was also the first step toward healing. He could no longer deny the fact that his actions had not brought him peace, only more pain and isolation. In the weeks that followed, Shahryar began to see the truth in Scheherazade's stories more clearly. Her tales, which he had initially seen as mere distractions, were now a mirror reflecting his own soul. The images of rulers who had ruled with justice, of heroes who had triumphed over their own weaknesses, and of people who had learned to forgive and find redemption began to resonate deeply with him. Each night, as she finished her tale and left him with a cliffhanger, he found himself yearning to hear the next chapter, not only because of the stories themselves, but because of the wisdom they offered. He began to seek her out in ways that were more than just the expectation of hearing another story. When she entered the room each night, he looked at her differently. No longer just a woman he had married out of a twisted sense of control, Scheherazade had become someone who held the key to unlocking his humanity, someone who was teaching him, day by day, that there was more to life than vengeance and bitterness. His feelings for her, once cold and distant, had now evolved into something more complex, an admiration that bordered on affection, perhaps even something deeper. One night, as Scheherazade prepared to leave, the king surprised her. After listening intently to her latest story, he asked, "Will you stay? Will you continue to guide me through the labyrinth of my own heart, as you've done with your stories?" The question hung in the air, a moment of vulnerability from the king that had never been present before. He had never asked anyone for help, let alone a woman. His pride, his sense of control, had always been paramount. But in that moment, something inside him shifted. He was no longer the king who demanded obedience and fear. He was a man seeking something he had lost long ago, connection. Scheherazade, ever the wise storyteller, smiled gently. "I will stay, my king. As long as you continue to listen, as long as you remain open to change, I will stay and guide you through this journey. But remember, true change comes not from mere words, but from action." Her words pierced him, and for the first time, Shahryar realized that his healing would require more than just hearing stories. It would require him to act, to take responsibility for the pain he had caused, and to change the course of his life for the better. As the days passed, Shahryar began to make small changes in his behavior. His interactions with his subjects became more thoughtful, and he started to show mercy to those who had once been at his mercy. His rule began to shift, subtly at first, but unmistakably toward a path of compassion. He still struggled with his emotions, still felt the weight of his past mistakes, but the seeds of redemption had been planted in his heart, and Scheherazade's stories had nurtured them, encouraging him to take the first steps toward becoming the ruler and the man he had always been capable of being. As the seasons passed, the transformation of King Shahryar began to deepen, his heart softening with each passing night, and Scheherazade's role in this change became even more significant. What began as a mere means of survival for Scheherazade had gradually evolved into something more profound, a journey of mutual understanding and shared growth. The king's initial curiosity had given way to genuine admiration, and with each story she told, Scheherazade skillfully unraveled the complex emotions that had kept Shahryar locked in the prison of his own grief. Through the lessons embedded within her tales, she began to illuminate a path toward healing, one that was not just about forgiveness, but also about understanding the depths of the human heart, the impact of choices, and the power of compassion. Scheherazade's stories had started to focus less on the adventure or the drama of the narrative, and more on the deeper messages that they carried. She had learned that the king's transformation wasn't simply about hearing thrilling tales, it was about learning the wisdom that each story contained. She began to shape her tales to reflect the complexities of life, the delicate balance between justice and mercy, the struggle between pride and humility, and the journey of understanding one's own soul. One such story that stood out to Shahryar was about a once proud ruler whose empire had been vast and powerful. This ruler was the envy of all who crossed his path, and he lived a life of indulgence and excess. His wealth and status became his identity, and as his empire grew, so did his arrogance. He began to believe that he was untouchable, that no one could ever challenge his rule. The ruler's obsession with power led him to forsake his people, his values, and his humility. In the end, however, his empire crumbled. The people, once loyal to him, grew disillusioned with his tyrannical ways, and his trusted advisors betrayed him, leaving him alone and powerless. The ruler's downfall was a result of his own hubris. He had believed that his wealth and status made him invincible, but in reality, it was his lack of compassion, humility, and wisdom that led to his destruction. Scheherazade's voice had been steady as she narrated the ruler's tragic decline, and she could see the impact her story had on the king. Shahryar sat in silence for a long time after she finished, clearly reflecting on the story. He, too, had once been consumed by pride in his power and his rule. But the stories Scheherazade had told him were gradually helping him see that true strength did not come from dominance, but from humility and the ability to listen, to learn, and to grow. The story of the ruler was one that Shahryar deeply resonated with. It forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that, in his own life, he had allowed his grief and anger to cloud his judgment, and that his sense of justice had often been warped by his pain. Like the ruler in the story, he had once believed that his actions were justified by the hurt he had suffered. But as Scheherazade continued to tell her tales, the king began to see that no amount of revenge or punishment could heal his wounds. Only understanding and forgiveness could bring him the peace he so desperately sought. Scheherazade also told stories of sacrifice, where characters were forced to give up everything they held dear for the greater good. One such tale was about a great warrior who, after leading his people to victory in countless battles, was faced with a choice: to continue fighting for personal glory or to step aside for the sake of his people's future. The warrior, having known nothing but battle his entire life, was torn between the desire for honor and the realization that true strength lay in protecting those who depended on him. The warrior chose the latter, sacrificing his own glory for the well-being of his people. The lessons in sacrifice and selflessness resonated deeply with the king. He had been consumed with his own pain and pride for so long that he had forgotten the importance of others, the people who looked to him for guidance and protection. Scheherazade's stories reminded him that leadership was not about personal gain or revenge, but about responsibility and the greater good. The king, in his solitude, had neglected his duty to his kingdom, focusing only on his own sorrow. But as he listened to the stories of those who had learned to sacrifice their desires for the benefit of others, he began to see the possibility of a new path, one that was grounded in compassion and service to others rather than revenge. Scheherazade's tales also began to address the themes of forgiveness. One night, she told the king a story of two childhood friends who had been inseparable throughout their youth. However, one of the friends was wronged by the other, and the betrayal was so deep that it tore their friendship apart. The betrayed friend, hurt and angry, sought revenge, but over time, he realized that the anger and resentment he held only hurt him, not the one who had wronged him. He made the difficult decision to forgive, and in doing so, he freed himself from the pain that had consumed him for so long. As she finished the story, Scheherazade looked at Shahryar, her gaze gentle but firm. "Forgiveness is not just for the one who wronged you, my king," she said softly. "It is for yourself." To hold on to anger is to carry a burden that will weigh you down for the rest of your life. Only by forgiving can you truly be free. The king's heart wavered at her words. He had spent so many years consumed by his own anger and hurt, unable to let go of the betrayal he had suffered. But Scheherazade's stories were slowly teaching him that to forgive was not to forget or condone what had been done to him, but to release himself from the chains of bitterness. The possibility of forgiveness began to feel like a distant light on the horizon, a light that beckoned him to walk toward it. With each story, Scheherazade's words began to take deeper root in the king's heart. The wisdom in her tales started to dissolve the hardened layers of grief and resentment that had built up over the years. Shahryar began to see the world through a different lens, one that was no longer clouded by anger, but colored by compassion, understanding, and the desire for peace. He no longer viewed the world as a battlefield where he had to fight for control, but as a place where forgiveness, mercy, and justice could coexist. Each night, the king grew more and more enchanted, not just by the stories themselves, but by the woman who told them. Scheherazade had not only saved his life, but had given him something far more precious, the possibility of redemption. The more he learned, the more he realized that he had been living in a prison of his own making. He had been so focused on revenge and power that he had lost sight of the things that truly mattered: love, forgiveness, and the strength to change. As the nights wore on, King Shahryar's transformation continued. The emotional landscape within him, once clouded with anger and revenge, was now beginning to clear. The bitterness that had stained his heart for so long slowly ebbed away, replaced by the healing power of Scheherazade's words. The stories she told, tales of sacrifice, justice, and redemption, had become more than just narratives. They had evolved into guiding principles, teachings that helped him navigate his own emotional turmoil and, most importantly, began to show him a way to truly forgive, not only the woman who had wronged him, but himself. Scheherazade's stories had dug deep into the king's soul, challenging him to confront the roots of his pain. She had spoken of rulers whose tyrannies had led to their downfall, of heroes who had triumphed over their own flaws, of friendships torn apart by betrayal and healed by forgiveness. These stories had done more than entertain, they had provoked reflection, opening a window into the king's heart and mind. And with each passing night, Shahryar began to understand that the key to his peace lay not in continuing his cruel rule, but in relinquishing the anger that had ruled him for so long. One evening, as Scheherazade finished telling a story about a king who was betrayed by his most trusted advisor, the king sat still, the silence between them growing heavy with thought. The king was no stranger to betrayal. It was the very thing that had driven him to commit unspeakable acts against countless women. But this story, about a ruler who had been wronged and yet chose to extend mercy to his betrayer, struck a chord with Shahryar in a way the others had not. The king in the story had seen that the cycle of hatred could only be broken by a conscious decision to forgive, not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to understand the greater good in breaking free from the chains of resentment. Scheherazade's voice, calm and unwavering, seemed to echo in the king's heart as she spoke. "To forgive, my king," she said softly, "is not to forget the wrongs that have been done, but to release the grip that anger and hatred have over you. In forgiving, you free yourself, not just the one who has wronged you." The weight of her words lingered in the room long after she had finished the story. Shahryar was no longer the man who had been consumed by revenge. He could see it now, clearer than ever. His quest for vengeance had not healed his wounds, it had only deepened them. His cruelty had not punished his betrayer, it had punished him, and it had punished countless innocent lives along the way. His heart, long heavy with sorrow, was beginning to understand that true power did not lie in domination or punishment, but in mercy and grace. Over the following days, the king found himself reflecting more on these themes. He thought about the women who had been lost to his cruelty, the young lives that had been extinguished before they had even had a chance to flourish. He thought of his own suffering, of how the grief of his wife's betrayal had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. His pain had once been the driving force behind his every action, and for a time it had made him feel justified in his cruelty. But now, as he listened to Scheherazade's stories of forgiveness and redemption, he began to see that the only way out of his torment was through the very thing he had been running from for so long, forgiveness. But forgiveness, he realized, was not easy. It wasn't just about pardoning the woman who had wronged him, he also had to forgive himself. For years, he had blamed others for his pain, but now he saw that his actions, driven by anger and bitterness, had only perpetuated the suffering. He had hurt people, innocent people, in the name of his own grief, and that was a sin he could not ignore. For the first time, Shahryar began to understand that true healing came not from seeking retribution, but from accepting his own flaws and failures and making amends where possible. One night, after a particularly poignant story of a king who forgave his enemies and was rewarded with peace, Shahryar sat in deep contemplation. He had heard many stories over the course of the months, but none have resonated with him as deeply as this one. It was as though the universe itself had conspired to bring him to this moment of clarity. He realized that he could no longer continue the cycle of hatred he had set in motion. He could no longer hold on to the anger that had defined him for so many years. For the first time, Shahryar knew what he had to do. He had to forgive, not just for the sake of others, but for his own sake. He needed to let go of the past that had defined him and open himself to a future filled with the possibility of love, peace, and understanding. The next night, as Scheherazade entered his chamber to begin another tale, the king surprised her. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and remorse. "Scheherazade," he began, his voice steady but soft, "your stories have taught me many things, but perhaps the most important lesson is that forgiveness is not a weakness. It is strength. And I wish to begin by seeking forgiveness for the lives I have destroyed, for the pain I have caused. But most of all, I wish to forgive myself." Scheherazade's eyes softened with compassion. She had known that the king was changing, but hearing these words from him filled her with a deep sense of hope. She had never once doubted his potential for change, but hearing him take responsibility for his actions and express a willingness to change was a moment of triumph. Her task, though difficult, was beginning to bear fruit. She had not only saved her own life, but she had helped the king begin the long, painful process of healing. "Forgiveness, my king, is the first step toward peace," she said gently. "By seeking it, you free yourself from the chains of the past, and you open your heart to the possibility of a brighter future. This is the path to redemption." As the night drew to a close, Shahryar knew that his journey was far from over. He had taken the first step, but there were still many more to take. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had finally let go of the anger that had once consumed him. He had forgiven, and in doing so, he had set himself free. And as Scheherazade departed, leaving the king to his thoughts, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the days passed after King Shahryar's decision to seek forgiveness, a palpable change swept over the palace. The once oppressive air of fear and resentment that had pervaded the royal chambers had given way to an atmosphere of hope and possibility. Shahryar's transformation was no longer just a personal shift, but a ripple that began to affect the entire kingdom. His reign, once marked by cruelty and death, began to change direction. With each passing day, his decisions became more thoughtful, more just. The king no longer ruled through fear, but through wisdom and mercy. Scheherazade's role in this transformation had been far more than just that of a storyteller. She had been the catalyst for the king's redemption, a beacon of light that guided him through the darkness of his grief and anger. But her task was not yet complete. As the king's heart healed, and as his rule became more merciful, the kingdom began to look at her not just as the wife who had survived the king's wrath, but as a queen who had saved her people with the power of her words and wisdom. One day, Shahryar summoned Scheherazade to the royal hall, the place where so many lives had been decided. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick with anticipation, and the courtiers who gathered there knew that something significant was about to unfold. Scheherazade entered the hall, her head held high, her steps steady and graceful. She had never been a woman to seek power for its own sake. Her mission had always been simple: to survive, to protect others, and to heal the broken heart of the man who had once been her executioner. But in doing so, she had transformed the kingdom, and in return, the king had come to see her not just as a wife, but as a true partner. Scheherazade, King Shahryar began, his voice steady and filled with sincerity. For 1,001 nights, you have shared your wisdom with me. Through your stories, you have not only saved my life, but also brought salvation to my kingdom. You have shown me that there is strength and compassion, that true leadership is rooted in justice, mercy, and understanding. You have transformed my heart, and through that transformation, you have brought peace not only to me, but to all of my people. He paused, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, there was no shadow of doubt or anger in his gaze. There was only love, respect, and gratitude. On this day, I declare you not only my wife, but my queen. You have earned this title, not through birthright or lineage, but through your courage, your wisdom, and your unwavering belief in the possibility of change. Together, we will rule this kingdom with justice and compassion as equals. You are no longer the woman who told stories to save her life. You are the woman who saved us all. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Scheherazade's heart fluttered. She had never expected this. She had never sought to be queen. Her mission had always been to heal a broken heart, not to claim power. But now, standing before the king, she realized that the transformation they had both undergone had brought them to this moment where they could not only rule as husband and wife, but as true partners, united in their vision for a better future. With tears welling in her eyes, Scheherazade stepped forward. She bowed before the king, but her words were filled with the strength of everything she had learned during her time in the palace. My king, you have forgiven me and given me a chance to live, but you have also shown me that forgiveness is not just for the past, but for the future as well. Together, we will build a kingdom of peace, a place where mercy and justice are the foundation of our rule. I accept your offer, not out of pride, but with a heart full of hope for what we can accomplish together. The courtiers who had gathered around them witnessed the moment with awe. It was a symbol not just of a change in the king's heart, but of a new era in the kingdom, one that promised peace, understanding, and the possibility of redemption. The people, too, would see this transformation. The tyrant who had once ruled with fear and violence was now a man who ruled with love, supported by a queen who had taught him that the greatest power lies in compassion. The days that followed were filled with a renewed sense of unity. King Shahryar and Scheherazade worked together, side by side, to create laws that reflected the values of justice and mercy. The kingdom began to flourish again, not because of the riches it had accumulated, but because the people felt safe, respected, and heard. The land that had once been filled with sorrow now thrived with hope. The queen, though humble and never seeking the throne for her own sake, became a beacon of wisdom and compassion. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the voice of every person, no matter their rank or station, was heard. Scheherazade's influence spread far beyond the palace walls, and under her guidance, the kingdom became known throughout the land as a place where kindness ruled, where justice prevailed, and where forgiveness was the foundation of peace. As the years passed, the tale of King Shahryar and Scheherazade became a legend, one that was passed down through generations. The king, once a man of cruelty and vengeance, became a symbol of redemption, while Scheherazade, the queen, was revered for her wisdom, her strength, and her ability to heal a broken kingdom. Together, they ruled with love, understanding, and a deep respect for one another. And in doing so, they created a legacy that would endure for generations, proof that even the most broken of hearts can be healed, and that through compassion, forgiveness, and the power of storytelling, a kingdom can be transformed. That's the story of Scheherazade and Raja Shahryar. Hopefully this story can help you sleep. Good night.